Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Holland Park Synagogue. Before COVID, we were having an open day once a year as part of B'nai B'rith's open synagogue, and it's actually great to be doing it again after a gap of about 3 years. And we'd like to welcome all our guests, particularly those from the Faith Forum in Kensington, and all our guests from Lauderdale Road or Wembley. And our guests from Holland Park. You're the members, sure. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my wife, who's going to talk about Sephardi Smugglers' tales, and I hope you enjoy it.
Okay.
Are you okay with science, or do you want to?
Well, I can do it.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Just to say a little bit about what I've been doing in the last sort of 16 years. I founded an organisation called Harif, which is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and also known as Sephardi Jews, sometimes Mizrahi Jews, Oriental Jews. Now we Sephardim, and this is a Sephardi synagogue, but we Sephardim are a small minority of the Jewish community in this country. And we find that a lot of people do not know very much about us, how come we came to this country. First of all, I really need to explain that this community actually was founded by Sephardim, but they were from Spain. They were fleeing the Inquisition, so that was back in the 17th century. But the people I'm most concerned with really are the latest wave of Sephardi Jews who left Arab and Muslim countries. So over the last 15 or so years, I've been sort of gathering information about them. I've got a blog, I've written a book, and we've got a very active Zoom program, which we started during COVID. And we broadcast about once every 2 weeks. If anyone's interested, we examine different aspects of history and culture. And next week, actually, I'm very excited about our event next week. We're talking about the Jews of the Azores. And the Azores are a group of islands in the middle of the Atlantic. And would you believe Jews from Morocco actually founded a community there? And so we're actually getting somebody from the synagogue in the Azores to talk about that community. So, on to Sephardi Smugglers' tales. The illegal immigration of Jews from Arab countries. I'm sure many of you will recall the film Exodus, when desperate survivors of the Nazi Holocaust arrived on Israel's shores. Well, it wasn't Israel then, it was still British Mandate Palestine, only to be turned back by British destroyers and actually sent back to Germany. But that episode actually marked a sort of turning point in public opinion, and they do say the Exodus launched the state of Israel. It was sort of a decisive moment. Before the establishment of Israel, illegal aliyah, which is the Hebrew word for immigration, from European countries, that's garnered the most attention, and rightly so, because these immigrants comprise the majority of clandestine arrivals. Illegal immigration before 1948 was known as Aliyah Bet, and it's short for Aliyah Bilti Legalit, which means illegal immigration. And Mossad Aliyah Bet was funded by an American organization called The Joint, and they were set up actually to help refugees. And Mossad Aliyah Bet was the name given to a section of the Palmach, which is the elite fighting force of the Haganah. And the Haganah later became the Israel Defense Force. Aliyah Bet was mainly by sea, in defiance of quotas imposed by the British White Paper of 1939. After Israel was established, this task fell to the Mossad, Israel's secret service. In the post-war years preceding the creation of the State of Israel, some 100,000 immigrants arrived. It is claimed that as many as a third of them might have come from Arab or Muslim countries, but we don't know the exact figures. Once founded, Israel could fling open its gates and accept all Jews who wanted to come. There followed some of the greatest migrations in history by land, sea and air. 650,000 Jews arrived from Arab countries. 90% of the communities of Libya, Iraq and Yemen, and a third of the Jews of Morocco within a couple of years of the founding of the state. But the window to leave soon closed, and Arab countries would not allow their Jews out. They were hostages to the conflict. This was the case for 6 years in Morocco, Egypt and Iraq until the 1970s, and Yemen and Syria until the 1990s. So for decades, hundreds of thousands of Jews risked life and limb to flee secretly from these states. So during World War II, I'll go back to World War II and start at the beginning. Ironically, around 4,000 Yemenite Jews came as legal immigrants. And that was because there were not enough Jews from Europe to fill the quota of legal immigration permits set by the British. And here you see the figures. During the war, it was difficult for Jews to travel, obviously, even from communities which were relatively isolated and not in the thick of the war. But there were examples of Jews in Muslim lands who helped European Jews escaping Nazism. And this lady here at the top is called Hélène Gazès Benatar. She was living in Morocco and she helped European refugees into and out of Morocco, mostly, and they went on mostly to the US and Canada. And there is a scene in the film Casablanca where these refugees who are in transit in Morocco actually gather in a bar, Rick's Bar, which was a meeting point for these refugees. Morocco was then actually under the pro-Nazi Vichy regime, but the local population was not in as much danger as in Europe. Although the front line between Germans and the Allies came perilously close to Egypt, Egyptian Jews helped thousands of refugees from Europe who passed through Egypt. Women met ships en route to Shanghai, which was then a haven for refugees. And they met these ships with money and medical care. And the Jewish hospital in Alexandria here was instrumental in helping sick refugees. There was one incredible story. A German ship's captain wanted to return his refugee passengers to Europe. And Jews from Alexandria, with the aid of Egyptian policemen, drugged the Jewish passengers, took them to the hospital, and later put them on a patrol boat to Palestine. Then there was the episode of the Tehran children. 1,800 Jews found themselves stranded in Iran in 1941. These Jews were mainly from Poland, and when the Nazi-Soviet pact was abrogated, they were just left there. 800 of them were children, many without their parents. And members of the Persian Jewish community managed to supply the malnourished and traumatized refugees with housing and food. And in 1943, a group of 716 of them left Iran and got to Palestine by sea via Karachi and Aden, then Egypt. Another group was smuggled overland through Iraq. And here you see the children having arrived in Palestine, looking actually smartly dressed and getting on with their education. So in 1944, it became Zionist policy to encourage immigration from Arab countries, the so-called 1 million plan. As Arab anti-Semitism rose, the plight of Jews became more desperate. But while the British were in charge, the only way into Palestine was to try to run the shipping blockade or employ an overland smuggling route. So Zionism in French-ruled North Africa became very active in 1943. But emigration did not become legal until 1949. Local Zionist youth groups set up an underground network with the help of smugglers. And almost 1,000 passed through a camp, a secret camp called Tanas on the Algerian coast, and boarded Haganah ships bound for Palestine. And this graph shows the numbers of migrants travelling on the illegal ships. It's a bit confusing, as there were Ashkenazi or European migrants leaving from North African ports and North African Jews leaving from ports in Europe, France, Greece, Sweden, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. And this pie chart shows that the highest percentage of Jews leaving North Africa came from Morocco, and then Algeria and Tunisia, then 8% from Libya. And this is the transit camp in Tanas in Algeria. This man here, Shmuel Sibon, has an interesting story. He was a teenager from a town called Sefrou in Morocco, and one of the few not a member of a Zionist group. And he wanted to go to Palestine. On the appointed day of departure, he was walking with two friends when a truck swerved into the three of them, wounding one and killing the other friend. Shmuel escaped unscathed. He ran away, and that night he took the train to the Tanas transit camp in Algiers. And he spent a month at Tanas, where food was short and lice were plentiful. He boarded the Yehuda Halevi ship from the Algerian coast. A voyage which should have taken days lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks with little food and no showers. The ship was surrounded by British vessels. One holed the ship, the Yehuda Halevi, and water poured in. The ship was diverted to Cyprus, where Sibon spent 9 months. The camp inmates greeted the passengers. "Where are the Africans?" expecting to see black Jews. And this is another of the Haganah ships, the Shifat Zion. And here you see a family from Tunisia trying to make their way to Palestine. So it wasn't just individuals, members of Zionist youth groups, but families as well. The famous Exodus had 50 North African Jews aboard. Africa on the Exodus. It was a tiny number of the 4,000 passengers. This is one of them, Shlomo Buskila. There was nothing to eat. he reported. And the best thing was he met his wife Hava, who was a Hungarian Holocaust survivor. In Libya, the Jewish brigade, which was made up of soldiers, Palestinian Jewish soldiers, they fought alongside the British, and they did much to inspire the local community in Libya to make aliyah, emigrate to Palestine, and 90% of the community eventually did. Until 1949, however, some 1,300 actually made it to Israel via Italian displaced persons camps. They were survivors of horrific wartime labor camps in Libya, such as Jado, where about 500 Jews actually died of starvation or typhus. And they also were survivors of the 1945 Tripoli pogrom, in which 130 Jews were killed. Many of these survivors who made it to Palestine did not have any kind of citizenship, and the International Refugee Organization was not very sympathetic, and they claimed they were not asylum seekers but economic migrants. After Israel was declared, emigration from Morocco, which was still a French protectorate, became legal, and waves of Jews made for the border with Algeria. In 1948, riots broke out and 48 Jews were killed. After independence in 1956, Morocco introduced a ban. Emigration went underground. And here you see this Mossad operative actually forging documents or passports for the immigrants. And at first Tangier, and then the Spanish territories of Ceuta and Melilla became important staging posts. And Tangier is actually opposite Ceuta, at the tip of Morocco there. Migrants headed for Gibraltar on commercial shipping lines, and then boarded Jewish agency ships bound for Israel. They were not told when they would be leaving, only the time and place when a vehicle would pick them up. They were given false papers. The smuggling was timed to coincide with pilgrimages to saints' tombs or Christian celebrations. The police were bribed at exit points. The migrants ran the risk of being arrested and tortured. Jews continued to leave in secret until the Egoz disaster in January 1961. The Egoz was the name of this ship, which is also known as the Pisces. The ship was about to do its 13th illegal crossing to Gibraltar. All 42 on board were drowned when the ship capsized, including the Spanish machine operator. The captain saved himself. But the tragedy caused the emigration ban to be lifted. And between 1961 and 1964, nearly 100,000 Jews left Morocco as part of Operation Yachin, which was an effort conducted by the Mossad following an agreement with the King of Morocco. And basically, the Moroccan government was paid a ransom for each emigrant, something like $250 a head. And when we were in Israel, in Ashdod, which is a great city for North African Jews, a lot of North African Jews live there, we came across this memorial, which was the memorial to the sunken ship, the Egoz. And this is a memorial commemorating the heroism of those who helped the illegal immigrants from North Africa, also in Ashdod. So, Syrian migration. In 1942, Ali Abed began to send emissaries to Iraq, Syria, Iran and Lebanon, and about 9,000 Jews, including 1,300 Syrian Jews, were escorted in daring and complex operations overland to Palestine. Rachel, who was the wife of Israel's second president, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, took a special interest in these migrants, and she made it a priority to bring teenage girls from Syria. And by 1945, 1,000 young people had made the journey to Palestine. Of course, these were all illegal immigrants into Palestine, and here's one testimony from a man called Nissim Arkeli. He gives a graphic description of his escape from Syria. The Arab border smugglers sat us on horses, and instead of saddles, we sat on several sacks. The road, which wound through mountains and hidden wadis, was difficult and taxing, with the ever-present life-threatening danger of falling from the horses and breaking one's neck on the rocks. We very quickly developed calluses on our bottoms and thighs. By the second night, the calluses had become very painful, bloody wounds. In November 1947, conditions became critical for Syrian Jews. Riots broke out in Aleppo, resulting in most of the population, the Jewish population, fleeing. Thousands were smuggled into Palestine. But they also went from Syria to Lebanon, the only country to see its Jewish population increase. One of those who made the journey to Lebanon was the father or the parents of Rabbi Eli Abadi. And Rabbi Eli Abadi may be known to some of you as the senior rabbi in the Gulf states. You know, once the Abraham Accords were signed, he became a key figure in the Gulf and the interface between the Jewish community and the Gulf states. Anyway, this is his father's story. He had to make an escape, a dramatic escape, after sending his family ahead of him to Lebanon. My father boarded the train to Lebanon. A train official he knew hid him in the cargo hold, warning that if he sneezed, they'd both be caught and killed. As soon as the train crossed the border, he jumped off the moving train and into a ravine, suffering only minor bruises. He began walking through Lebanese terrain, travelling at night. Eventually, he found his wife and children. They were stunned when he walked through the door. The first illegal immigrants to mandate Palestine from Iraq arrived on their own after the 1941 massacre known as the Farhud. They came primarily through Jordan, a route 1,500 kilometers long. Some walked all the way. The shortest and quickest route was along the pipeline, the oil pipeline. That's the bottom line you see on the map. Bedouin smugglers, taxi drivers, even officials of the Royal Jordanian Court would act as guides. But the Iraqis and the British could thwart Aliyah with military inspections, and migrants could be imprisoned and interrogated. Smugglers charged excessive prices. The Zionist movement was willing to pay 100 dinars or more per emigrant. Several hundred left, posing as tourists, with forged passports. Avner Shashua was detained when he tried to escape. One evening we were called to leave. Bedouin clothes were prepared for us, abayas, akals and keffiyas. We got into the waiting car with the driver, or smuggler. At one of the curves in the road, the police were waiting for us. The smuggler was in cahoots with the police. We were taken to a detention centre. We had no beds, no mattresses and no blankets. We grabbed a corner and sat on the floor. Mossad preferred a route through Syria from Mosul to Kamlishi, Aleppo, Damascus or Beirut. From 1943 to 1946, about 5,000 of the 7,500 immigrants from Iraq were smuggled in twos and threes across Israel's northern border. Many returned to Iraq, not managing to adjust to their new environment. Emigration was stagnating by 1947. The Zionist movement in Iraq had 2,000 members, but only 50 had made it to Israel. And so we come to Operation Michaelberg. Shlomo Hillel was increasingly frustrated. He was a 23-year-old Mossad agent who had moved to Israel from Iraq. Operation Michaelberg was conceived when he learnt of 2 World War II US veteran pilots with an itch for adventure and empty pockets, and they'd offered their services. They flew a C-46 plane to Baghdad with Hillel aboard. The plan was for 50 immigrants to be transported in 10 cars past an Iraqi military camp and then climb through a breach in the airport fence. The plane almost took off without the passengers of the 10th car, but it arrived just in time. The plan worked perfectly. They landed in a field in the Galilee. A Mossad agent handed the pilots a briefcase of cash. The Haganah ran the operation one more time, bringing back 50 more Iraqi Jews before the outbreak of war between Israel and the Arabs made the operation too risky. It's an incongruous sight, actually. If you go and visit the Atlit Museum of Clandestine Immigration, which is near Haifa, you will see this plane. It's the latest edition. It's not actually the original plane, but it's a replica.
It is the original plane, that one.
No, it wasn't. It's one that came from Alaska.
I thought they said it was the original plane.
I think he got it wrong. Anyway, no, we had this young guide who I think he got it wrong. But anyway, this is the latest addition to this army camp where illegal immigrants were detained during the British Mandate. And apparently it took years to be tracked down, and it was finally found in Alaska. And it represents the first time that a civil aircraft was used to transport illegal immigrants from the Muslim world. And with the arrival of this plane at this Museum of Clandestine Immigration and the inauguration of a dedicated hall, clandestine Sephardi immigration takes up its rightful place in Israel's history. And it's a tribute to those who risked their lives to rescue and be rescued, and they're finally being remembered. In 1948, Iraq declared war on Israel. By the way, this is what you see when you go into the plane. There's a sort of little video that they show you, and it traces the route that the plane took to the north of Israel there. So in 1948, Iraq declared war on Israel and ramped up persecution of its Jews. Illegal immigration surged through the south of the country and over the border into Iran. And soon it was running at 1,000 people a month. the situation became so embarrassing for the Iraqi government that it decided to allow emigration for 1 year only, thinking only hotheads and undesirables would want to leave. And as it turned out, 120,000 Jews registered to go, almost the entire community. Shlomo Hillel went back to Iraq to negotiate the airlift. And those are the Jews who were smuggled over the Iranian border in 1949, before immigration became legal. And it became legal for just 1 year. Shlomo Hillel went back to Iraq to negotiate the airlift, which became known as Operation Babylon or Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. And in 1949, Israel made a deal with Alaskan Airways to transport Yemenite Jews from the British colony of Aden at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. So this is Shlomo Hillel and Operation Babylon. And these are the great airlifts. There's a great airlift from Iraq, 120,000 Jews, and one from Yemen, 50,000 Jews. The Yemenite Jews were in a desperate state. Many had walked through the desert to the Hashad transit camp in Aden, which was then a British protectorate. Hundreds died of malnutrition and disease, but ultimately 50,000 Jews were airlifted on 450 flights to Israel between 1949 and 1950. Almost the entire community. And throughout the 1950s, 60s and into the 1990s, Mossad continued to run clandestine operations from Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Iraq and Iran. They saved thousands of Ethiopian Jews in the 1980s and 90s and brought them to Israel. And now I would like to play you an extract from an interview with a man called Moshe Gartan, who was the last Jew to be smuggled out of Iraq before the Six-Day War broke out. Now, when the Six-Day War broke out, things became extremely bad for the Jews, as you will testify, because she was in Iraq at the time. The conditions really deteriorated very badly and culminated in 9 Jews being executed amongst 14 people in 1969. So Moshe Gartan was convinced that he would have been the 10th man to be executed had he not been smuggled out of Iraq. So the traditional smuggling route was through the south of the country there, as you can see, from Basra across the water and into Iran.
And there was a woman and a few children as well. And he said, "You wait, we'll get a small boat to..." I waited, and then come the late afternoon, we hired a small boat for a trip on the river, so to speak. We were all on the boat and started going down the river. And the smugglers' boat wasn't there. It was not showing up, so we came back again to Basra. And let's go another round and another round. And the boat was not coming. It was getting dark, cold. And then in the distance we saw the light flashing of the smuggler's boat. So we told the guy to carry on straight. And then we came, all of a sudden, there was a bit of fog and the boat appeared. We were like side by side. And the boatman saw it and started shouting, "Jews are escaping! help. And from nowhere, we see the patrol boat came with machine gun, searchlights, and it was a split-second decision. What do? Either jump in the other boat, where you may be caught anyway, or stay in this one and you will be caught anyway. So this young boy jumped onto the smuggler's boat. I handed him the children whilst the boat was fast approaching, and jumped to the other boat, and he took off. In the meantime, the smuggler was giving this boatman money to shut up, and he wouldn't. He kept shouting, "Jews are escaping." So the smuggler's boat took off at high speed, and thank God they had a more powerful boat than the police boat. Smuggling is their business. It's not us Jews. They smuggle cigarettes, liquor, merchandise. We were just part of the commodities. And then the shooting started behind us. So the guy said, "You all lie on the floor of the boat," and he put a tarpaulin on top of us. And he started shooting at the patrol boat. So what would have been a 10-minute crossing took in the end 5.5 hours, because he had to get out of the Shatt al-Arab. I think we coasted Kuwait to go to the sea and lose them. But not before a lot of bullets were on top of us. And in the end it got so dark, and he stopped the engine, and we can see the searchlight trying to locate us, and they couldn't. And then they went back. And then we went the full circle back to where we should have been. And it was a terrifying experience, but that's the way it happened. We got to the other side of the border and got off the boat, and I heard a dog bark, and I heard a man saying, "Shut up, Nasser." At that time they were anti-Nasser. "Shut up, Nasser." So I said, "Where are we?" He said, "Don't be afraid, you're now in Iran." And then there was a small stream to cross in a little boat as well, and we got on the other side, and there was a car waiting with an Arab in his robe and everything. And the minute we arrived, he pulled up the robe, and there were trousers, and he put on a hat, Western hat, a tie and thing. He drove the car. We went through the border control, and I saw something which was very curious. He was giving the Iranian soldiers gold coins. Every time there was a control point, he was giving them gold coins. This was money given to these people because they were helping, because whatever you want to call it. This was money that I didn't pay for. None of the people who...
Yeah, sorry, it cuts off before the end, but he says this was money that he didn't pay for. This was money that the state of Israel was paying to save Jews wherever they were in danger. And the end of the story is that the smuggler ended up being caught and hanged. The police patrol boat that challenged the smuggler's boat was changed at the last minute, and the new police boat crew had not been sufficiently bribed at all. So this was just one of many examples, really, of clandestine operations they continued throughout the 60s and the 70s whenever Jews were at risk, from Egypt, from Morocco, from Syria and Lebanon, from Tunisia after the Bizerte crisis, from Syria after the 67 war, and from Iraq in 1970, when Jews were actually smuggled with the help of the Kurds through the north of the country and over the border into Iran. And I'm glad to see that we have one person here who did do that journey, didn't you? No, you didn't. You didn't.
The majority of the community
did. That's right. About 2,000 Jews left in this way from Iraq, and this is a picture of one of the last cohorts from the Frank Eni school. All Jews who would have left Iraq, every single one of them would have left either illegally smuggled through Kurdistan or lucky enough to get a passport eventually. I think in 1972 they started issuing passports. And of course there were the great operations from Ethiopia, also very dramatic stories. And after the revolution in Iran, Jews were smuggled out mainly through Turkey or through Pakistan. And so that would take another lecture, I think, to tell you about all those. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Does anyone have any questions for Lyn?
Yes, I have a question. I don't know the full history, but I do know that in 1941 Syria was controlled by the Vichy French, and they were overcome in a military campaign where Mossadegh lost his eye, but there was a British military offensive there, and likewise they put down a revolt in Iraq.
That's right.
So who was running those countries then after those operations? Were they part of, were they ruled by Britain as a military occupation for a period of time?
Yeah, the Vichy regime in Syria only lasted about 6 months. So during that time, they didn't have time to implement the anti-Jewish laws.
No, what I'm curious about was because...
And after that, the French sort of re-established, not the French, because they were the Vichy, the British, it came under the British sphere of influence because they were fighting to gain control of the oil.
So they would have, and so therefore, because those areas were British and there was a white paper, that was why they needed to be illegally immigrated into Israel.
Yes, that's right. So it was the British Mandate of Palestine and the British Mandate of Iraq, which actually was nominally independent, but in fact the British controlled foreign policy in Iraq. And certainly they regained control after that pro-Nazi coup in Iraq in 1941, which Rashid Ali coup, which resulted in that terrible massacre, the Farhud, in June 1941.
So it's because of the British White Paper that there would have been illegal immigrations in the later part of the World War II from those territories?
Exactly.
Right, okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think this lady was here.
Yes.
First. Yes.
I might have missed what you said at some point, but I wasn't sure why Mossad, why the secret police, why they were so involved. I mean, why they were doing what they were doing, smuggling people.
Well, because it was illegal. They were not allowed to do it in plain sight. They had to go underground. So they set up an illegal network of groups and operatives. And they had these workshops making forged documents, and they made contacts with smugglers, and they arranged all the funding of these smugglers to pay them, obviously, and of course they organized the journeys themselves. They told people to meet at a certain time and take the train, meet the boat, and etc. So, you know, it needed a whole organisation, but this organisation was secret, you know.
So that was at the beginning of the secret police.
Well, the Mossad was an arm of the defence force. Yes, it was. It was a sort of secret branch of it, and obviously it did other things as well, not just illegal immigration. But that was like one of the main objectives of the State of Israel. You know, that they felt that they had to save Jews who were in danger and rescue them. Yeah.
Just to explain a little bit, making Aliyah from these countries after the Second World War,
Yeah.
Because obviously during the Second World War there was an enormous sense of persecution and loss of that. But in a lot of these countries, what would you have been a sense of persecution, of fear of life, or would it have been, how much would it have been, we need to get away from this country, even though we may have been living in this country for a long time as Jews, and to what extent is it fear we need to leave now because things are getting worse for us, or do we need to leave because we see our home now as being a positive thing, as being going to Israel, the state of Israel?
Well, I'd say that it was a mixture of the two. I mean, there were state-sanctioned laws passed in these Arab countries, Arab League member countries. And the worst law, I mean, they froze bank accounts, they sacked Jews from their jobs, so they didn't have livelihoods anymore. And the worst thing was that Zionism became a crime. So in other words, you could be arrested, you could be tried, and you can even be executed. And they executed the wealthiest Iraqi businessman, Jewish businessman, who actually had absolutely no contact with Israel. He was not a Zionist, a man called Shafiq Addis in 1948. And that created a terrible shock in the community, because they thought, well, if the best connected, wealthiest Jew could be executed, what future is there for us? And that is probably one of the main reasons why there was a mass exodus from Iraq. Also, there was a lot of violence, you know, and there were bombs going off, like for instance in Egypt. There were riots in Aden. There were riots in Libya. So, you know, people felt physically at risk. And after 1948, there was somewhere where they could go.
Yes.
You know, unlike the European Jews during the war.
I'm going to interrupt because Liz isn't telling her family story.
Oh no, don't.
Her father was a civil engineer who studied in England during the war and then went back to Iraq, which was desperately short of engineers. They would not let him work. It was not because of these Nuremberg-style laws allowed to work as an engineer. He was an orderly and all. He was a clerk in a hospital. Lyn's parents got married and they had this law that they couldn't have a group of more than 6 people together at a wedding. They arrested Lyn's father and Lyn's father's brother, and the family had to pay most of their wealth to get them out. And at that point of time, with the not allowed to work, being basically held hostage just for getting married, they knew at that time they had to get out. Were they forced out at the point of a gun? No. But did they know they had no future there? Yes.
So, does that answer your
Yeah,
question? Yeah, Ruth.
I'm very interested to hear that people from Pakistan were involved.
Well, no, that was the smuggling route from Iran.
But there must have been people high up in Pakistan who knew, in Pakistani circles, who knew one of the most anti-Israel, anti-Semitic countries. It's fascinating that actually they do anything for money, basically.
Well, yeah, I think that is absolutely the answer, isn't it? That you know, smugglers, that's their business. You know, you pay a smuggler to do a job, and regardless of his political opinions.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is there must have been people in authority who turned a blind eye. Whether
Possibly,
they were paid whether they must have been paid to turn a blind eye, but they would have been in terrible danger had they been found out.
I'm not sure there was an awful lot of interest in what was going on in the remote, you know, borders of Pakistan with Iran. You know, I'm not sure the Pakistanis would be that interested in that.
Possibly not, but they might have. wanted to make an example for as a
I don't know. I don't know.
I have not. It was just fascinating that even today, one of the most anti-Israel, countries in the world had that history.
Yeah. It is fascinating, isn't it?
I remember there was a movie out some years ago called Charlie Wilson's War, and it was about an American senator who wanted to help the Afghanis who were at that stage fighting the Russian invaders. And American policy was, we don't want to really get involved, and he felt he needed to do something. And so using his connections, he basically got aid to them via Pakistan. And part of it was Israeli aid.
Right.
And there's this couple of scenes in it where he's speaking to the Pakistani president or his high official and says, look, we're going to ship this stuff in. He said, where's it come from? He says, Israel. He says, you won't know about it. He says, if I see a single marking Star of David on it, you're out of here. But the point is, the Pakistanis knew that the Americans were shipping Israeli gear via them to Afghanistan. So there is a kind of history of Pakistan turning a blind eye.
Well, there you go. Yeah. That could well be.
It was a major feature film, Charlie Wilson's War, which I remember.
I'll look out for it. Thank you. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Just one question. Is this the whole operation that you've been describing extremely interesting? Is it all finished, or is there any unfinished business?
Well, I'm wondering if it's still going on in Iran. Actually, I think it's quite possible that people are being smuggled out of Iran.
Well, I suppose there's things perhaps you're not at liberty to say.
No, well, this is the whole problem about this, that, obviously all the Mossad operatives worked in secret and probably took secrets with them to the grave. So there was actually there was no public recognition of what they did. Recently, there was a book published by Matty Friedman. I don't know if you came across it, Spies of No Country. No. And he interviewed some of the early Mossad spies in Israel who were actually from Syria, and they were sent over the border because they were Arabic speaking to kind of blend in with the Arabs, and that was how Mossad started, actually, at a very basic level. And that was the first time that anybody had written a story like that, had actually written up the story of these people who actually spent their whole lives anonymous, and they unrecognized. And so many of them actually died, they risked their lives. And, but I think Israel's building a Mossad museum, actually, to tell the stories of some of these operations.
Just want to tell you where it is.
They won't tell you where it is. Exactly.
The Iranian community, as I'm led to believe, is that the Jews that remain in Iran put on this they're sort of like a show.
Yes. Yeah.
Of, oh, look how religiously tolerant we are.
Yeah.
And therefore they're very afraid to step out of line and say anything else. Yeah, absolutely, And the Secret Service people are all over the place to make sure that they say all the right things to the visiting journalists. Indeed. Yeah.
That's how it was everywhere, even in Iraq. You can't open your mouth and say anything.
Yeah.
So anytime somebody came from abroad, they had security with them, so you can't say anything at all.
I remember seeing, I think it was at Lyn, I don't know if you were there. There was a film about the Jews of Iran.
Of Iran, and it was all about the present day community and how safe they, it was a propaganda thing, obviously. Yeah, it was a propaganda thing. But it was very interesting to see, as you say, just saying what they're told to say. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Did you want to say any more about how life was in Iraq?
Especially the first time during, at the end of '68, when they caught a lot of Jews, mainly from Basra, and they accused them of spying. Unfortunately, the 9 hanged, and the 10th one, his father was Jewish. And in those days, I would say a lot of the community, including my late father, were in prison. and the chief rabbi's son. He was there for a whole year, and they got the chief rabbi to speak. He cannot say anything. He can't say his son is in prison, tortured, or dad is in prison, who used to be the head of the community, to speak or anything. Unfortunately, we lost quite a lot, because after those 9 hangings and the 10th one, who his father was Jewish only, they used to catch a lot of Jews from the street, and some of them disappeared, even with the bodies. And a whole family of the Qashqush, there were 5 of them, and then the brother and his wife also, they disappeared without even the bodies, they never got them.
That's right.
Was it a family who tried to escape, and then they found the suitcases with the chopped up bodies?
That's the Kashkush.
That's the Qashqush
Yeah,
family.
that's right. That's
they
right.
were going to travel the next day, and unfortunately, they got all. I mean, we remember them because they were with us at school, the kids. And you know, at first it was only men and then boys who were in prison, but then they caught women, they caught girls as well, and unfortunately the ones disappeared. Nobody knows where they are.
And actually there were about 50 who were killed and never found again. Nobody knows exactly what their fate was. And this was a huge number when you consider there were only about 2,000 Jews left in Iraq. So you can imagine what a state you were in, knowing that people were just disappearing like that.
It was very, very frightening, and that's how they started smuggling the Jews to the north with the aid of the Kurds. They went to Iran. At the time we were in, there was only about 200, 250 people left, and they allowed Jews to travel in 1972. 1973, the war started with Israel, so they closed it again, and then we had to reapply it to the whole year. It goes through security channels and, mukhabarat, we used to call it, and everybody else before you are allowed to travel. So when we traveled in October 74, it was exactly a year after the war.
On that note, I'd like to thank my wife for a lovely talk.
Thank you very much.